The war room smelled like despair and burnt circuitry, and every face around the long crystal table carried the same hollow expression that came from 40 years of losing. Empress Valith Sonorous stood at the head of the table, her tall silver frame casting a shadow over the glowing holographic map that showed the slow death of her empire, and she watched the red lines of the Crethane advance swallow another star system, while her generals argued about things that no longer mattered. "We have lost the Thyra corridor," Admiral Kelvin said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "And with it, 3 agricultural worlds that fed half our outer colonies." "Then we pull back to the inner ring," General Maven countered, but even she did not sound like she believed her own words. The Valithi Dominion had ruled 1,000 star systems for 10,000 years, and their people were tall and graceful, with skin that shimmered like moonlight, and eyes that glowed with the soft light of psionic energy that flowed through every one of them like a second heartbeat. They were beautiful and ancient and powerful, and they were losing this war in ways that none of them had ever imagined possible. The Crethane hegemony was everything the Valithi were not: brutal, armored in natural scales harder than steel, standing 8 to 9 feet tall with claws that could tear through hull plating, and they bred fast and fought faster, and they did not care how many of their own died as long as they kept pushing forward. "There is one option we have not discussed," the Empress said quietly, and the room fell silent because when she spoke quietly, it meant she was about to say something that nobody wanted to hear. She pressed a control on the table, and a new image appeared on the holographic display, a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in a forgotten arm of the galaxy. "Earth," she said. The silence that followed was not the respectful kind. "You cannot be serious," Admiral Kelvin whispered. "Are Deathworlders," General Maven added with visible disgust. "They live on a planet with active tectonic plates and apex predators and weather systems that could kill a Vialithi in hours. They are barely civilized. They live for less than 120 years, and they have no psionic ability whatsoever." "And yet," the Empress replied, "every major power in this galaxy has quietly avoided provoking them, and I find that very interesting." She turned to face her council with the calm authority of a woman who had already made her decision, and she told them the plan: a marriage alliance between the Vialithi crown and a human representative, a union that would bind Earth's military forces to their cause and bring the one species nobody truly understood into the war on their side. The court erupted, but the Empress did not waver. 3 weeks later, High Princess Celiara Valthian stood before her mirror in the royal chambers and studied her own reflection. With the cold, analytical gaze she usually reserved for battlefield assessments, she was 7 feet tall, with flowing silver hair, and eyes like liquid amethyst. A decorated war commander who had led fleets and broken enemy lines, and now she was being asked to marry a creature from a death world she had never even visited. She did not protest because duty was not a suggestion in the royal house. It was the air they breathed. She had spent the last 2 weeks reading everything available about humans, and had found them utterly confusing. They were a species of contradictions, capable of breathtaking cruelty and impossible compassion in the same breath. They wrote poetry and built weapons of mass destruction. They nursed wounded animals back to health, and then hunted other animals for sport. And their history was an endless cycle of war and rebuilding that would have driven any other species to extinction long ago. "They are chaos wrapped in skin," she muttered to herself, and then the announcement came that the human shuttle had arrived. The royal court gathered in the grand arrival hall, a cathedral of living crystal that sang softly in harmony with the psionic energy of everyone present, and they waited with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt as the massive doors opened. Through them walked a single man. Ethan Cole was not what any of them expected. which was perhaps the first sign that they had already underestimated him. He was just under 6 feet tall, which made him almost comically short compared to the Vaethi towering around him, and he wore a simple dark dress uniform with minimal decoration, and he carried a small bag over one shoulder, as if he had packed for a weekend trip, rather than a political marriage that would reshape galactic politics. His hair was dark and slightly messy, his jaw was rough with stubble, and his eyes were a warm brown that held a quiet steadiness, which did not match the casual way he carried himself. He looked around the magnificent hall filled with beings who could crush his mind with a thought, and he smiled. Not a nervous smile or a diplomatic smile, but the easy, genuine smile of a man who was simply glad to be somewhere new. "That is our savior?" a noble whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, and soft laughter rippled through the court. Seliara stepped forward, because the sooner this ritual began, the sooner it would be over, greeted him with the formal words required by protocol, her voice as cold and precise as a blade. Ethan looked up at her. He had to look up considerably, and his smile did not falter. Instead, it softened into something warmer, something almost gentle, and he said, "I know this is not what either of us imagined, but I would like to try to make it something worth having." She had prepared herself for arrogance or fear or crude simplicity, but she had not prepared herself for kindness, and it threw her off balance in a way that no enemy fleet ever had. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the Temple of Eternal Light, and it was the most tense celebration in Vaethi history. Thousands attended, and most of them looked like they were attending a funeral rather than a union, and the whispered insults about the human were constant and not particularly quiet. Ethan endured all of it with a patience that Seliara found either admirable or suspicious. She had not decided which. The ceremony required a psionic bonding ritual, where the priestess would link the minds of the bride and groom to seal their union in the light of shared consciousness. And when the ancient priestess reached out with her vast psionic power to touch Ethan's mind, something happened that nobody expected. The priestess flinched. It was small, just a tiny jerk of her hands, and a quick flutter of her glowing eyes, but Seliara saw it, and she saw the way the old woman's fingers trembled for the rest of the ceremony, and she saw the look in the priestess's eyes that was not confusion, but something closer to awe mixed with something that might have been fear. Ceremony concluded, and Ethan Cole became Prince Consort of the Vaethi Dominion, and the galaxy continued to burn, and nobody asked the priestess what she had seen inside the human's mind, because nobody thought it mattered. That night, Seliara could not sleep, and she found Ethan standing on the balcony of their shared quarters, looking up at the unfamiliar stars of a sky that was not his own. The light of 3 moons painted him in silver and blue, and he looked so small against the vast alien horizon, and for a moment she almost felt something like sympathy. She reached out with her psionics, carefully, gently, just to sense his emotions the way she would read any new person in her life, and what she found stopped her cold. There was no wall, no shield, no resistance of the kind she had been trained to detect. Instead, there was depth, an ocean of feelings so vast and so deep that her psionic senses could not find the bottom. And it was not empty, it was full, impossibly full, like an entire universe of experience and emotion compressed into one fragile human frame. And she pulled back with her heart pounding, because she had touched the minds of thousands of beings in her life, and none of them, not one, had ever felt like that. She stood in the doorway and stared at the back of this small, quiet man she had married, and for the first time in her long and certain life, High Princess Seliara Valthian felt something she did not recognize. It was uncertainty, and it terrified her more than the war ever had. The first weeks of the marriage were a study in contrasts that the entire Vaethi court watched with a mixture of fascination and disdain. and Ethan Cole moved through the crystal halls of the royal palace like a man who had wandered into a museum and decided to make himself comfortable. The nobles did not bother hiding their contempt. They called him Sarethi, which loosely translated to the Empress's leashed beast, and they said it loudly enough for him to hear. And they made jokes about his short lifespan and his small stature and his complete lack of psionic ability, and they waited for him to react with the fragile emotional outbursts they expected from a primitive species. He never did. Instead, he learned their language with a speed that made the royal tutor uncomfortable, mastering the complex tonal shifts of High Vielithi court dialect within 2 weeks, when most alien diplomats took months. He memorized the names of every servant and every guard in the palace, and greeted them each morning with a warmth that confused beings who had never been acknowledged by royalty or anyone connected to it. He asked questions constantly. Not foolish questions, but sharp, precise ones about Vailithi history and culture and military structure that revealed a mind working much harder than his easy smile suggested. The servants began to like him first, which annoyed the nobles more than anything else he could have done. Celiara watched all of this from a careful distance, while she continued commanding border defense fleets through the palace's long-range communication arrays, and she told herself that she was observing him out of strategic necessity and not curiosity, and she almost believed it. She noticed things that did not fit the profile of the simple primitive the court believed him to be. She noticed how he moved through rooms, not with the casual wandering of a tourist, but with the deliberate awareness of someone who was constantly mapping exits and sightlines and potential threats, the way a soldier moved through hostile territory while pretending to be relaxed. She noticed that his resting heartbeat, which the palace medical sensors tracked automatically, was slower than any Vailithi soldier she had ever commanded. A deep, steady rhythm that spoke of a body trained to conserve energy and remain calm under conditions that would send most species into panic. She noticed that he never slept more than 4 hours, and that he used the remaining hours of darkness to read Vailithi military histories in the palace library, and that the books he chose were not the polite diplomatic overviews, but the detailed tactical analyses meant for war college students. And she noticed his reflexes. It happened during a formal breakfast when a servant stumbled and a crystal glass fell from a tray. Ethan's hand moved and caught it before it had fallen 6 inches, a motion so fast that Celiara's psionic perception barely registered it. And he placed the glass gently back on the tray and smiled at the grateful servant as if nothing remarkable had happened. But Celiara had fought warriors from a dozen species, and she knew combat speed when she saw it. And what she had just witnessed was not normal for any species in the galactic database, let alone one that was supposed to be a fragile death worlder with no biological advantages. She ordered the royal physician to conduct a full medical scan, claiming it was standard protocol for a new member of the royal household. The results arrived on her personal data screen the next morning, and she read them 3 times because she was certain there had been an error. Ethan's bone density was 4 times the galactic average for humanoid species. His skeleton was essentially built like armor wrapped in flesh. His neural processing speed was comparable to mid-tier psionic species despite having no psionic ability whatsoever. His adrenal system was unlike anything in the Vailithi medical database, capable of flooding his body with chemicals that could temporarily enhance his strength and speed and pain tolerance to levels that the physician had flagged as biologically improbable. And his immune system was so aggressive that it had already begun adapting to Vailithi atmospheric microbes that should have taken months to acclimate to. When she confronted Ethan about the results, keeping her voice carefully neutral, he simply shrugged and said, "Humans are pursuit predators. We evolved on a world where we were not the fastest or the strongest or the most armored." He said, We became something else. We became the thing that never stops chasing, never stops adapting, never stops getting back up, and that is written into every cell we carry. He said it the way someone might describe the weather, and that casual delivery made it somehow more unsettling. A week later there was a state dinner to celebrate a minor diplomatic victory, and the hall was filled with nobles and ambassadors, and enough political tension to power a small starship. Selyara sat beside Ethan at the high table, and watched him navigate the complex social minefield with a quiet competence that surprised her. Then Ambassador Draelus Valsoon, a tall, arrogant noble who had opposed the human marriage from the beginning, rose from his seat and addressed the table with a smile that was not a smile. "I must congratulate the princess on her new companion," he said, in the elaborate High Violithi dialect reserved for formal insults. "It takes true courage to bind oneself to a creature whose entire civilization is younger than our oldest gardens. Perhaps he can teach us all what it means to achieve so very little in so very short a time." The room went quiet, and every eye turned to Ethan, and Selyara felt her jaw tighten, because she knew that no human could possibly understand the layered linguistic complexity of what had just been said, and she was already forming a response of her own when Ethan spoke. He spoke in perfect High Violithi, court dialect, not just the words but the exact tonal patterns and rhythmic structures that took Violithi children decades to master. And he said, "The ambassador is kind to notice our youth, and he is correct that our civilization is brief by Violithi standards. But I would gently observe that a species which has achieved interstellar travel and survived its own self-destructive tendencies in less than 10,000 years might have something to teach a civilization that has had 100 times longer and still finds itself losing a war it cannot afford to lose." The silence that followed was so complete that Selyara could hear the ambient hum of the crystal walls. Ambassador Draelus sat down without another word, and his face had turned a shade of pale silver that Selyara had never seen on a Violithi before, and she hid a smile behind her glass, because it was the first time in this entire miserable arrangement that she had genuinely wanted to smile. Found herself thinking about Ethan Cole as something other than a political burden, and she did not know what to do with that feeling. 3 nights later she woke to a sound she did not recognize, a low, broken murmuring coming from the other side of their shared quarters. And she found Ethan tangled in his sheets, drenched in sweat, his face twisted in an expression of such raw anguish that it made her chest ache. He was whispering coordinates and names, human names that meant nothing to her, and his hands were clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles had gone white. And without thinking, she reached out with her psionics and brushed the very edge of his dreaming mind. What she saw nearly broke her. Fire, a world on fire, plasma bolts raining from a dark sky, screaming that went on and on and on. And Ethan, younger, thinner, covered in blood that was not his own, carrying a wounded soldier through a storm of destruction, while his own body burned and his own voice screamed, and he did not stop. He did not put the soldier down. He kept moving through the fire, because that was what he was, and that was what humans did. They kept moving when everything in the universe told them to fall. She yanked herself out of his mind and sat in the dark with tears streaming down her face, and she understood something that the court and the nobles and the generals had all missed entirely. Ethan Cole was not a diplomat, and he was not a pawn, and he was not a primitive creature sent to fulfill a political arrangement. He was a survivor of something terrible, and whatever had broken inside him had been rebuilt into something she could not yet comprehend. The next day, she secretly contacted Violithi intelligence and requested Ethan's full military file from the Unite Terran Federation. What came back was mostly black bars, redacted lines covering entire pages. But what was visible mentioned a single phrase that she could not stop thinking about. Project Prometheus. Classification level, above sovereign. She did not know what it meant, but it sat in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood. 2 nights later, a Crethane assassin breached the palace security grid. A lone operative, 8 feet of armored scales and killing intent, sent to eliminate Selyara during a night council session. Ethan intercepted the assassin in the corridor outside her chambers. He had no weapons and no armor, and no psionic shields, and the Crethane were a species built for war the way stars were built for burning. And when the palace guards arrived 90 seconds later, they found the assassin unconscious on the floor, with 6 broken bones and a look of absolute bewilderment frozen on its face. Reptilian face. Ethan was standing over the body, breathing normally, without a single scratch on him, and he looked at the guards with that same easy smile and said, "You should probably upgrade your perimeter sensors." Selyara watched the security footage 7 times, and each time she watched it, she noticed something new. The speed of his movements, the precision of his strikes, the way he had targeted the exact gaps in the Crethane's natural armor, that only someone with advanced anatomical knowledge would know. And on the 7th viewing, she paused the footage on a single frame that showed Ethan's face in the moment before the final strike. His eyes were calm, and there was no rage and no fear in them, only a quiet, terrible certainty that she recognized because she had seen it in the eyes of every truly dangerous being she had ever faced. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of, and it changed everything. The Crethane hegemony launched their biggest offensive in 10 years on a cold morning when the stars above Alindra Prime were still visible through the crystal domes of the War Council chamber. And the holographic maps showed a wave of red sweeping toward the Valithi agricultural worlds like a slow tide of blood. 3 critical food-producing systems were under direct threat, and if they fell, the Valithi Dominion would face famine within 6 months. And famine would do what 40 years of war had not. It would break the spirit of a civilization that had endured everything the Crethane could throw at them. Selyara was ordered to take command of the defense fleet personally, and she began preparing within the hour, her mind already running through fleet formations and supply calculations. And when Ethan told her he was coming with her, she almost refused. "This is not a diplomatic function," she said, her voice carrying the sharp edge she used with subordinates who questioned her orders. "This is a war zone," Ethan replied, and the way he said it made her remember what she had seen in his dreams, and she did not argue further. The VSS Alindra's Grace was a Valithi dreadnought, 2 kilometers of living crystal and advanced weaponry crewed by 5,000 of the best soldiers in the Dominion. And Ethan was given observer status with a small chair in the corner of the war room, and the officers treated him with the same polite dismissal they might show a visiting academic who had no business being near actual combat. That lasted about 3 days. On the first day, Ethan sat quietly and watched the tactical displays and said nothing. And on the second day, he sat quietly and watched and said nothing. And on the third day, the fleet received intelligence that a Crethane battle group was moving to flank their position through an asteroid field, and the officers debated the best response. 20 minutes before Ethan spoke from his corner. "They are not flanking you," he said, and every head turned. "The battle group in the asteroid field is a distraction. Their real assault will come from below the orbital plane in approximately 6 hours, using the radiation shadow of the gas giant to mask their approach. And they will target your supply ships first, because that is what I would do." Admiral Calvin stared at him with an expression balanced between insult and curiosity, and he asked how a human with no psionic foresight and no neural combat implants could possibly predict enemy movements with that level of specificity. Ethan's answer came in a voice so calm it was almost gentle. "Humans have been fighting war since before we had written language. We have had 10,000 years of practice killing each other, and every generation learns from the last, and we wrote it all down so our children could be even better at it. Pattern recognition is not magic, Admiral. It is survival. And no species in this galaxy has survived more than mine. 6 hours later, the Crethane attack came from exactly where Ethan said it would, and the Veilithi fleet was ready, and the enemy lost 14 warships before retreating in confusion. After that, nobody told Ethan to stay in his corner. The real test came at the Battle of Thyra's Veil, a nebula so dense with charged particles that it turned every advanced sensor into static, and disrupted psionic communication like a wall of noise between every mind in the fleet. The Veilithi had always relied on their psionic networks for coordination. Their commanders could feel each other's intentions and share tactical information at the speed of thought. And without that ability, they were reduced to basic radio communication and visual coordination. And it was like asking a species that had always been able to fly to suddenly walk through mud. The Crethane knew this, herded the Veilithi fleet into the nebula deliberately, and when the trap closed around them, there were 60 Crethan warships surrounding them, and the Veilithi officers began to panic in a way that Celiara had never seen from her people before. The bridge of the Alindris Grace was filled with raised voices and conflicting orders, and the kind of fear that comes from being blind in a dark room full of predators. And Celiara was shouting for order when a voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Everyone be quiet," Ethan said, and he did not shout, but somehow his voice carried the weight of absolute authority that came from a place far deeper than rank. And the bridge fell silent. He walked to the central tactical display and began issuing orders, not through psionic links or advanced computing, but through his voice, his eyes, and a mind that processed spatial combat with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural, but was in truth the product of a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of organized violence. He adapted an ancient Earth naval doctrine called crossing the T, a maneuver designed for two-dimensional ocean warfare, and reshaped it for three-dimensional space combat in a nebula with no sensors, using the Veilithi ships as elements in a pattern that no psionic species would ever conceive, because it relied not on shared consciousness, but on individual initiative, trust, and the willingness to act without perfect information. It was messy and imprecise and brutal, and it was the most beautiful piece of tactical thinking Celiara had ever witnessed. The Veilithi fleet punched through the Crethane formation like a fist through glass, and when the nebula cleared and the surviving enemy ships fled into the dark, a cheer went up through the fleet that Celiara felt in her bones. Word spread fast, the way it always did on warships, and by the next morning, every sailor and soldier in the fleet knew that human prince consort had saved them all. They began calling him Sarkithis, the Quiet Storm, and it was said with a respect that no human had ever received from a Veilithi before. But the officers were divided, and Celiara could see it in their faces. Half of them looked at Ethan with admiration, and the other half looked at him with a fear that was deeper and more honest. And she overheard a conversation between two senior captains that stayed with her long after. "He is remarkable," the first captain said. "He is terrifying," the second captain replied. "And what frightens me most is that the humans sent him as their diplomat. Think about that. This is what they considered appropriate for a peace mission. What do you suppose their actual soldiers look like?" After the battle, Celiara found Ethan alone in an observation deck, sitting on the floor with his back against the transparent wall, and the vast field of stars behind him, and his hands were shaking in a way she had never seen from him. Before, he was not celebrating. "How many?" he asked without looking up, and she knew what he meant. 1,100 Veilithi, she said quietly, estimated 3,000 Crethane. He closed his eyes, and she watched him count in silence. Not the strategic numbers of a tactician assessing losses, but the personal count of a man who carried every death as a weight on his conscience. And she understood then that the thing that made him extraordinary was not his tactical mind or his impossible reflexes or whatever secret his government had buried in classified files. It was that he cared, deeply and truly, about every single life on both sides, and that caring did not make him weak. It made him the kind of leader that others would follow into fire. She sat down beside him on the cold metal floor, and for a long time neither of them spoke. And then she told him about her sister Malera, who had been killed in the war's first year, who had been gentle, kind, and who had wanted to be a healer, and whose death had turned Selyara into the cold weapon the Dominion needed her to be. And Ethan told her about his squad, 12 soldiers he had served with and loved like family, all dead in an operation he could not name, on a world he could not mention. And he said, "I became a medic because I was tired of being the reason people stopped breathing." She took his hand, and he let her, and it was the first time they had touched without protocol demanding it. And his hand was warm, and rough, and steady, and she held it like it was something worth keeping. 2 days later, the fleet intercepted a Crethane raider, and during the brief battle, they captured a high-ranking Crethane officer, who was brought aboard for interrogation. The officer was massive, even by Crethane standards, scarred and proud and defiant, and he answered most questions with contempt and silence. But when the interrogator mentioned that a human had been responsible for the defeat at Thyra's Vale, the Crethane officer laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the metal walls. And then he stopped laughing, and his reptilian eyes went wide, and the defiance in his face was replaced by something raw and genuine. "You allied with the Deathworlders?" he said, and his voice was no longer mocking, but thin with disbelief. "You absolute fools! You think we avoided Earth because they were beneath our notice? You think we ignored an entire species because they were irrelevant?" He leaned forward against his restraints, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "We avoided Earth because every projection, every simulation, every wargame we ever ran told us the same thing. Do not provoke the humans. Do not corner the humans. Do not give the humans a reason to look up from their little blue world and turn their attention to the stars with anger in their hearts. Because if you do, they will not stop until everything you have built is ash." The recording of that interrogation spread through the fleet within hours, and Selyara watched it alone in her quarters, and felt the hair on her arms rise in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. A week later, the news came that broke everything open. The Crethane hegemony had assembled their supreme fleet, the Iron Tide, 10,000 warships under the command of Grand Warlord Draxus himself, and they were heading directly for Aelindra Prime. The war was no longer at the border. It was coming for the heart of the Dominion, and every alarm in the Empire began to scream at once. Selyara found Ethan in the war room, and he was not panicking, and he was not planning, and he was not doing anything she expected. He was sitting calmly in a chair, with his eyes closed, and when she called his name, he opened them, and she saw something in those warm brown eyes she had never seen before. A light, faint and golden, flickering beneath the surface, like embers waiting for wind. "It is time," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the air feel heavy. "Contact Earth. Tell them Prometheus is awake." And for the first time since the war began, Selyara felt something she had forgotten existed. She felt hope, and it was burning. 10,000 Crethane warships dropped out of hyperspace above Aelindra Prime, and the sky went dark. It was not a poetic darkness, or a metaphorical one. The sheer mass of the Iron Tide blocked the light of the nearest star, and the shadow that fell across the crystal cities and bioluminescent forests of the Valethi homeworld was cold and real, and carried with it the promise of extinction. The orbital defense platforms activated with a hum that shook the ground, and the Velithi home fleet, battered and outnumbered 5-1, formed a defensive line between the planet and the advancing armada. And every soldier in that fleet understood with perfect clarity that they were probably going to die today. Empress Velith Sonories addressed her people from the throne of light. Her voice broadcast to every ship and every city and every shelter where frightened Velithi huddled with their families, and she said, "We have stood for 10,000 years, and we will not fall in silence. If this is our end, then let the galaxy remember that the Velithi did not kneel." It was a beautiful speech, and it was a farewell, and everyone knew it. Then the transmission from Earth arrived. It was not a fleet, not yet. It was a simple message carried on a frequency that cut through every jammer and every interference field the Crethane had deployed. And it said, "Prometheus assets inbound. Estimated arrival, 4 hours. Hold the line." 4 hours against the iron tide seemed like asking a candle to survive a hurricane. And the Velithi High Command looked at Ethan Cole with the desperate hope of people who had run out of options and were reaching for anything that looked like salvation. Selyara stood beside him in the war room of the Planetary Defense Center, and she saw the change in him. The quiet kindness was still there, but beneath it, something else had risen to the surface. Something hard and bright and focused like a blade, being drawn from a sheath, and when the Empress gave him tactical authority over the combined defense forces, he accepted it with a nod and walked to the central command table and began to work. What followed was unlike anything the Velithi had ever experienced in their long history of war. Ethan dismantled their elegant defensive formation and rebuilt it from scratch, using principles that no psionic species would ever conceive. He split the fleet into dozens of small independent groups and gave each group a set of conditional orders that allowed them to operate without central coordination. He deployed swarms of mining drones, reprogrammed as autonomous weapons, with AI routines that made them unpredictable even to their own controllers. He seeded the space between the two fleets with sensor decoys that mimicked the signatures of capital ships. And he ordered 3 cruisers to broadcast Crethane military frequencies filled with false intelligence about a flanking force that did not exist. "This is madness," Admiral Calvin said, staring at the chaotic tactical display that looked nothing like the ordered geometric patterns of Velithi war doctrine. "This is human war doctrine," Ethan replied without looking up. "We do not fight fair, because fair is a luxury for species who have never been outnumbered, and we have always been outnumbered, by our predators, by our environment, by each other. And we learned a long time ago that the universe does not reward elegance. It rewards the willingness to do whatever it takes to survive." The Crethane advance hit the Velithi defense like a hammer hitting a wall of smoke. The wall was not there, and the hammer swung through empty space and found mines and drone swarms and false targets. And the elegant coordinated assault of the Iron Tide dissolved into pockets of confused fighting, where small Velithi strike groups appeared from nowhere, and struck hard, and vanished before the Crethane could respond. It was not clean, and it was not pretty, and it cost lives on both sides. But it was working. The Crethane advance slowed from a charge to a crawl, and every minute they were delayed was a minute closer to whatever was coming from Earth. Then the boarding parties came. Grand Warlord Draxus was not a fool, and he recognized that the human strategy depended on keeping the Crethane at range, where their numerical advantage was diluted by confusion. So he sent waves of boarding craft directly at the Planetary Defense Center. Hundreds of armored shuttles carrying Crethane shock troops whose only mission was to cut the head off the snake. The defense center's shields held against the first wave and the second, but the third wave breached the outer hull, and suddenly there were Crethane warriors, 8 feet tall, armored in natural, Scales that could deflect energy weapons, armed with plasma blades and a killing fury that their species was famous for, pouring into the corridors. Ethan ordered Celiara to continue commanding the space battle, and then he walked toward the breach. She grabbed his arm and said his name, and he looked at her with those warm brown eyes that now held a golden light she could not explain, and he said, "Trust me." Then he was gone, moving down the corridor toward the sound of gunfire and screaming, with nothing but his bare hands and the strange light building beneath his skin. The security footage from the next 4 minutes was classified at the highest level by the Velithi military, but Celiara watched it, and she would never forget what she saw. Ethan met the first Crethane warrior at a junction point, and the creature was twice his size and armed with a plasma glaive, and it swung at him with the kind of force that could cut a Velithi soldier in half. Ethan moved, not away from the blade, but into it, inside the arc of a swing, and his hand struck the Crethane's throat with a precision that spoke of training so deep it had become instinct, and the warrior fell. Then the next one came, and the next, and the next, and Ethan fought them like water flowing through stone. He was everywhere and nowhere, and every strike he landed found the gaps in their armor that only someone with perfect anatomical knowledge would know, and he absorbed hits that should have killed him. A Crethane fist caught his ribs, and she heard bones crack through the audio feed, and he did not slow down. A blade cut across his back, and blood sprayed against the wall, and he turned the movement into a throw that sent the attacker into 2 of its companions. And with every wound, the golden light beneath his skin grew brighter, until he was moving in a halo of warm fire that had no heat, but carried a force she could feel even through the screen. When it was over, 12 Crethane warriors lay broken in the corridor, and Ethan was standing in the middle of them, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his body wreathed in golden light that pulsed with his heartbeat. And his eyes were not brown anymore, they were burning with a soft, fierce radiance that made him look like something out of the oldest Velithi legends, the ones about gods who wore mortal flesh. Celiara found him after the corridor was secured, and she stood before him, while medics tried to approach, and he waved them away. And the golden light was fading from his skin, but not from his eyes, and she said the only thing she could say, "Tell me the truth, Ethan, tell me what you are." And he told her. Project Prometheus was humanity's answer to a galaxy full of species that were stronger, faster, longer-lived, and psionically gifted in ways humans could never naturally match. When Earth scientists realized that every major spacefaring civilization had some inherent biological advantage, they did what humans had always done throughout their history. They refused to accept their limitations, and they found a way around them. Prometheus was a program that unlocked potential buried deep in the human genome, abilities that had been dormant for millennia, suppressed by evolution because they were too costly for a species that needed to survive on a hostile world with limited calories. The program enhanced cellular regeneration, forced open dormant psionic channels through a process that required extreme physical and emotional trauma, and activated something the UTF scientists called willfire. Willfire was the conversion of raw human emotion, willpower and pain and love and rage, and the stubborn screaming refusal to surrender, into pure psychokinetic energy. It was not elegant like Velithi psionics, which flowed from calm meditation and mental discipline. It was wild and raw and overwhelming, fueled by the one resource that humans possessed in infinite supply, the absolute bone-deep refusal to die. "Why did you hide it?" Celiara asked, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "Because the galaxy already fears humans," Ethan said, and his voice was tired and honest and sad. "If they knew what Prometheus could do, they would not just fear us, they would unite to destroy us before we could become a threat. And I did not want that. I came here as a man, not a weapon. I wanted you to see a partner, not a monster." She looked at him, this small battered human glowing with borrowed starlight, bleeding on the floor of a corridor he had defended with his bare hands against creatures twice his size. And she said, "I see both, and neither one frightens me." He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, the careful composure cracked, and she saw behind it something vast and vulnerable, and desperately human, and he almost smiled. Then the sensors screamed. The UTF fleet dropped out of hyperspace, and it was not the armada the Violithi had hoped for. It was 12 ships, just 12, sleek and black and unmarked, moving through the battle like shadows with teeth. Each ship was crewed by Prometheus operatives, and what they did to the Crethane Iron Tide was not a battle. It was a demonstration. They moved with a coordination that was not psionic, but something else entirely. A shared understanding born from training and trust, and the same fire that burned in Ethan's veins. And they cut through the Crethane formation with a surgical precision that left the Violithi watching in stunned silence. The Iron Tide, the greatest military force the Crethane hegemony had ever assembled, the fleet that was supposed to end the Violithi dominion forever, began to retreat. Grand Warlord Draxus, who had never retreated from anything in his life, ordered his fleet to pull back, and before he vanished into hyperspace, he broadcast a message on every open channel. "I challenge the human called Ethan Cole to single combat. Winner dictates the terms of the war. This is the ancient right of Krathval, and no Crethane will dishonor it." The Violithi court erupted. It was a trap. It had to be. Draxus was the most feared warrior in the hegemony, and he had killed dozens of opponents in ritual combat. And this was clearly a ploy to eliminate the one person who had turned the war on its head. Pause. But Ethan stood, and the golden light flickered behind his eyes like a promise, and he said, "I accept." So Yara grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks, and he looked at her, and the warmth in his eyes was real and deep and certain, and he said softly, "I did not come here to start a war. I came here to end one. Let me." And because she had learned to trust this impossible man who had walked into her world with nothing but a smile and a bag and a fire hidden inside him that could burn down empires, she let go. But she did not let go of hope. The duel was set on the shattered moon of Cayley's Drift, a dead world that hung between the two fleets like a scar in the sky, and every species in the galaxy with access to a broadcast receiver was watching, because this was the kind of moment that civilizations remembered for 1,000 years. The arena was a flat expanse of gray rock beneath a sky full of stars and warships, and the only light came from the distant sun and the running lights of 10,000 vessels that had stopped killing each other long enough to watch two warriors decide the fate of a war. Grand Warlord Draxus arrived first. He was 9 feet tall, and his body was covered in the dark iron scales of a Crethane Alpha, thicker and harder than any other member of his species, and he wore a suit of living metal armor that had been bonded to his flesh through a ritual so painful that most Crethani who attempted it died. In his hands, he carried a plasma glaive that was longer than Ethan was tall, a weapon that had killed over 200 opponents in ritual combat, and whose blade burned with a heat that could melt through starship hull plating. He stood in the center of the arena, and he roared, and the sound of it shook dust from the ground and echoed across the dead moon like thunder. Ethan Cole arrived on foot. He wore a simple black combat suit with no armor plating and no energy shields and no visible weapons of any kind, and he walked across the gray stone with the same easy stride he had used walking into the Violithi throne room on the day he arrived, calm, steady, unhurried, and the entire galaxy watched a man who barely reached the warlord's chest walk toward the most dangerous warrior the Crethane had ever produced with nothing but his empty hands. "He is going to die," Admiral Calvin said quietly from the bridge of the Elindra's Grace, where Selyara stood watching, the broadcast with her fists clenched at her sides. "No," she said, "he is not." Draxus spoke first, his voice amplified across every channel. "I have killed hundreds, little human, warriors and generals and kings. What makes you think you can stand before me?" Ethan stopped 10 meters from the warlord and looked up at him, and his voice was calm and clear and carried no anger and no bravado. "Because I am not fighting for glory or conquest or pride. I am fighting for the people behind me, and humans do not lose when we are fighting for the people we love." Draxus charged. The first blow came faster than any unaugmented eye could follow. The plasma glaive swept in a burning arc that should have cut Ethan in half at the waist. And Ethan moved, not backward, but sideways and downward, dropping beneath the blade with a fluidity that made the motion look effortless. The glaive passed through the space where he had been, and scorched a line across the rock, and before Draxus could recover, Ethan struck, one palm against the warlord's knee joint, the only spot where the living metal armor was thin enough to feel impact. And Draxus stumbled. The galaxy gasped. But Draxus was not a warlord because of his size alone. He was fast, impossibly fast for something that massive, and his recovery was instant. The glaive reversed and came back in a horizontal sweep that caught Ethan across the shoulder, and sent him spinning through the air to crash against the ground 15 meters away. Ethan hit the rock and slid, and blood sprayed across the gray stone, and a sound went through the watching Velithi fleet that was half scream and half prayer. But Ethan got up. He got up the way he always got up, not with drama or defiance, but with the quiet mechanical certainty of a body that had been trained to treat falling down as nothing more than the first step of getting back up. And as he rose, the golden light bloomed beneath his skin like sunrise coming from inside him. Draxus attacked again and again and again, each blow carrying enough force to crack the moon's surface, each swing of the plasma glaive fast enough to leave afterimages in the frozen air. And Ethan took the hits he could not dodge, and dodged what he could, and got back up every single time. Impact, the willfire grew brighter. He was not powering up despite the pain. He was powering up because of it. Every wound fed the fire. Every broken bone added fuel. Every drop of blood that fell on the gray stone was converted into energy by a body that had been engineered to turn human suffering into human strength. And the golden light that poured from Ethan Cole grew until he was visible from orbit, a small bright star standing on the surface of a dead moon, facing a giant who was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. Draxus drove the plasma glaive through Ethan's left shoulder. The blade punched through muscle and bone, and came out the other side, trailing fire, and the pain should have been enough to end any fight. And Ethan looked down at the blade in his body, and then looked up at Draxus, and his eyes were twin suns of golden light. And he grabbed the glaive with his bare hand. The living metal of the blade screamed, an actual sound, a high, keening wail, because the willfire in Ethan's grip was hotter than the plasma edge, and the weapon that had killed hundreds cracked and shattered in his fist like glass. "I have buried friends," Ethan said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried across every broadcast on every world in every corner of the galaxy. "I have held dying children in my arms. I have walked through fire and kept walking. I have given everything I am to protect people I will never meet. And you think this is enough to stop me?" The willfire exploded. It was not an explosion of destruction but of presence. A wave of golden energy that radiated from Ethan's body like the birth of the star, and every psionic being within range felt it wash over them like warm water. And what they felt was not rage or violence, but something far more powerful. It was love, vast and fierce and unconditional, the love of a man who had chosen to stand between everything he cared about and the thing that threatened it, and it was fueled by every loss and every scar and every moment of human history where someone had refused to give up. Ethan moved, and he was not fast anymore. He was inevitable. His fists struck Draxus with the force of willfire behind them, and the living metal armor cracked, and the iron scales beneath it shattered, and the Grand Warlord, who had never lost a fight in his life, staggered backward under an assault that was not technical or elegant, but raw and absolute and unstoppable. Ethan broke through the armor and broke through the scales, and drove Draxus to his knees on the gray stone of the shattered moon. The warlord knelt, beaten and bloodied, and he looked up at Ethan with an expression that no Crethane had ever worn before. It was not just fear, it was recognition. The recognition of a predator realizing that it had finally met something higher on the food chain. Ethan stood over him, burning with golden light, his fist raised for a final blow that would end the war and the warlord and a dynasty of violence that had consumed millions of lives. And every eye in the galaxy was on him, and every breath in the galaxy was held. He lowered his fist. He extended his hand. "The war ends here," Ethan said, and his voice was steady and warm and carried the absolute authority of a man who had earned the right to dictate terms through blood and fire and sacrifice. "Your people live, mine live, hers live. That is the deal." Stared at the hand for a long moment, and the galaxy watched, and the stars burned cold and silent above them. And then the Grand Warlord of the Crethane hegemony, the most feared warrior in the known galaxy, reached up and took the hand of the human who had beaten him. And the war was over. The peace treaty was signed 3 days later in the rebuilt council chamber on Alindra Prime, and the terms were fair to both sides, because Ethan insisted on it. And when the Crethane delegation asked why he had shown mercy to a species that had tried to destroy everything he was fighting for, he said, "Because mercy is not weakness. It is the hardest thing a strong person can do, and it is the only thing that breaks the cycle." Humanity's status in the galaxy shifted overnight. The species that every civilization had dismissed as primitive deathworlders, with short lifespans and no psionic ability, was suddenly treated with a deference that bordered on reverence. Diplomatic delegations flooded Earth from dozens of alien nations, and scientists and scholars and military leaders all came with the same question. How had a species so young and so fragile produced something so extraordinary? The answer was simple, and Ethan gave it during a Galactic Council address that was watched by trillions. We are not extraordinary. We are desperate. We have always been desperate. From the first moment our ancestors looked up at a sky full of things that wanted to eat them, and decided to survive anyway. Our strength is not in our bodies or our technology or our psionics, because we had none of those things. Our strength is in our refusal to accept that the fight is over, and in our ability to find something worth fighting for in the darkest moments, and in the simple, stupid, beautiful stubbornness that makes us get up one more time when every rational calculation says we should stay down. In the quiet days that followed, and the ceremonies and the galaxy-shaking revelations had settled into something like normalcy, Selyara found Ethan in the palace gardens at dawn. He was sitting on a stone bench beneath a tree that glowed with soft blue bioluminescence, and the first light of the Veiliki sun was painting the crystal towers in shades of gold and pink, and he looked tired and peaceful and human in a way that made her heart ache with tenderness. She sat beside him, and he took her hand without looking, as if he had known she was there before she arrived, and they watched the sunrise together in comfortable silence. "The willfire," she said after a while. "You said it burns brightest when fueled by something worth protecting." "It does," he said. "When did I become that for you?" He thought about it, and a small, honest smile crossed his face. "The night you sat on the floor of that observation deck and held my hand while I counted the dead. Every commander I have served under saw casualties as numbers, but you sat with me and let me grieve, and that was when I knew." She leaned against him, this tall silver princess, who had married a Death Worlder to save her people. And she said, "I married you because I had no choice. But I would choose you now, in every timeline and every universe, because you showed me that strength without kindness is just violence, and kindness without strength is just a wish." He put his arm around her, and the golden light was gone from his eyes, but the warmth was not. And they held each other as the sun rose over a planet and an empire and a galaxy that would never be the same. Months later, at a Galactic Council session on the neutral station of Parallax 9, a young alien diplomat, newly assigned and overwhelmed by the complexity of interstellar politics, watched the small human delegation enter the chamber. They were laughing and joking and nudging each other like children at a festival, and they looked so utterly ordinary that she could not reconcile what she saw with the stories she had heard. She turned to her senior colleague, a weathered veteran of 4 decades of galactic diplomacy, and asked, "Why does every species in this chamber treat them with such respect? They are so small and so few, and they seem so normal." The senior diplomat watched the humans take their seats, and a complicated expression crossed her face, something between admiration and caution, and a deep primal awareness that predated civilization itself. And she said, "Because they are the only species in this galaxy that looked into the void, found it full of teeth, and smiled back. Never forget what they are, never forget what they can become, and above all, never give them a reason to show you." The young diplomat looked at the humans again, at their easy smiles and their bright eyes and their small fragile bodies that hid an ocean of fire, and she felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Across the chamber, a human with warm brown eyes caught her staring, and he smiled at her, a genuine friendly smile with no fret and no agenda. And somehow that was the most terrifying thing of all.